In this video, you'll be learning about monohybrid crosses, or how we can predict the inheritance of a single gene within a mating between two individuals. Now, let's remember that humans and many other organisms are diploid organisms, meaning they have pairs of chromosomes. One of the chromosomes in each pair comes from each parent, from either the mom through her egg or through the father through the sperm. As these gametes unite in fertilization, we create the genotypes of our offspring. So let's look at this scenario. Here we have Daniel, and Daniel is albino, but both his parents have normal skin coloration. How is that possible? Well, we can use Punnett squares to understand how people inherit genes from their parents or make prediction about the offspring from two individuals. So when you set up a Punnett square, one side will represent one parent and the other side will represent the other. So let's say parent one is the eggs from the mother and parent two represents the father, so these would represent the sperm. And then you would always, in order to make the offspring, go from what's above and what's to the left. So 1 and 1 would make offspring 1. Okay, offspring 2 is made from gamete 2 from parent 1 and gamete 1 from parent 2. Okay, so it's always above and to the left. That is how you figure out and fill in your Punnett squares. So let's just look at albinism really fast. Albinism is what we would call an autosomal recessive trait. What that means is in order to be albino, you need to have 2 copies of the albino gene. And the albino gene is when the body does not correctly produce melanin, and so the melanocytes in your skin are not producing this pigment, which causes variation in skin color. Now, because it's autosomal recessive, the genotype little a will produce the albino phenotype, whereas big A and big A little a, so that's homozygous dominant, and heterozygous will produce the normal skin coloration. So let's look at Daniel. Okay, so Daniel's parents had normal coloration. That means they were either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Okay, Daniel must have the genotype little a because he's albino. He must have received a recessive little a allele from each parent. Therefore, each parent must have been heterozygous. They were what we would consider carriers of the albino trait. So before we talk about that word carrier, let's look at the Punnett square. Okay, so Daniel's mom was heterozygous. She had a dominant allele and a recessive allele. And then Daniel's dad, was also heterozygous. Dominant allele, recessive allele. And when those 2 recessive alleles unite, that little a offspring represents Daniel. Now, his parents had normal skin coloration, so they were able to produce melanin, producing their darker skin. Now, they are carriers. We say that because they carry the recessive trait. They're heterozygous. They themselves are not showing the recessive phenotype, but they possess the recessive allele. And we'll see that term carrier being used a lot throughout this heredity unit, especially for genetic disorders. Whenever you're presented with a heredity problem, here's some good path or steps to follow in order to kind of get to your answer. So the first thing would be to pick a letter to represent your gene if one isn't given to you. Then you should record what characteristics the dominant and recessive alleles represent. That's a really good habit to get, especially if the kind of mutant form isn't necessarily what you might expect. So maybe it's a dominant trait. And as a result, it might be confusing. You might lose track of which is dominant and which is recessive throughout your problem. You also want to determine the genotypes of your parents. From your genotypes, you can then figure out your gametes and set up your Punnett square. Then you're going to determine your results. So let's do this one together. In peas, long stems are dominant to short stems. A plant that is heterozygous for long stems is mated with a plant with short stems. All right, let's pause here. We need to figure out a letter. So why don't we do big L for long and little l for short. You could pick whatever letter you want. It's just helpful to have a letter that has unique uppercase and lowercase forms. Something like S or P can sometimes be difficult based on your handwriting to figure out, did you write capital or lowercase? All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to figure out the parents. So we have a heterozygous plant and a plant with short stems. All right, so heterozygous means you get two different alleles. So big L, little l. That's one parent plant. The other one is going to have short stems. The only way you can have short stems is going to be to have two recessive alleles, little l, little l. Okay, now you're welcome to pause the video and go ahead and fill in your Punnett square and see if you can answer the questions on your own, and then I'll show you how I filled it in. All right, so if I was to fill in this Punnett square, okay, this is the genotypes of the offspring that I would get. What fraction would be heterozygous? Well, that would be these two right there, 2 out of 4, so that's 1/2, or 2 out of the 4 would be fine as well. Okay, what's the probability of having a long-stemmed individual? In this case, we're looking for a phenotype. So we need to think long stem means you're either going to be big L, or big L, little l. So we can look and we can see that again, half of them, the same half, are going to have long stems. And so that's one way we can figure it out. All right, take a look at number 2. You're welcome to pause and kind of set up your Punnett square. Pick your own letter, and I will restart with my Punnett square completed, and then we'll talk about this idea of genotypic and phenotypic ratios. All right, I had a chance to set up my math, so to do my probabilities. So in peas, purple flowers are dominant to white flowers. So I picked F as my letter because capital P and lowercase p can sometimes be very similar. So I chose F. And it says 2 hybrid purple flowered plants are bred. So hybrid is another name for heterozygous. So hybrid is heterozygous and true breeding is going to be homozygous. Okay, so that's something that geneticists often use. So I have hybrid purple flowered plants and they're bred, and I want to know what the genotypic and phenotypic ratios are going to be of the offspring. Well, here you can see I filled in my offspring. So the first thing I need to do is I need to look at my genotypes. So I have 4 possible genotypes. So let's kind of circle them independently. So out of my 4, I have one that's big F, homozygous dominant. Okay, next up, if I look, I would see that there are 2 that are heterozygous. So I'd say 2 big F, little f. Sorry if that yellow is hard to read. Okay, and then my final one is going to be 1 homozygous recessive, little f. Okay, a ratio is always going to be written as something colon to something else. So it's numbers comparing within our total offspring population. Now notice, okay, that I took the time to write out what each number represents. And that is important, that if you're asked a question with ratios, that you tell me which number is which, so that I can clearly tell you understand how to solve the problem. Okay, so that's my genotypes. Okay, the problem is that not all those separate genotypes result in different phenotypes. So now I have to think which ones are going to be purple and which ones are going to be white. So let me just kind of clear off some of this coloring that I did. Okay, so that we can get a better idea of phenotypes. Okay, I'll go back to my purple. All right, so I need to find which ones are going to be my different phenotypes. So I have purple, and I'm going to compare that to white. So in this case, being purple means you have at least one dominant allele. So in this case, it would be 3 purple, and I have 1 white. So that is my ratio that I'm going to set up. All right, try this third one about cystic fibrosis. Read through it and see if you can do it, and then check your answer back here in a minute. All right, let's look at this last problem. So I picked A to represent my alleles for cystic fibrosis. You can pick whatever letter you want. So my dominant allele is for normal airway passages. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic trait where ion channels don't form properly, and as a result, salt builds up, and salt can lead to improper water balance, which means that you can end up with really thick mucus that can block airways. Okay, so dominant allele, normal airflow. Lowercase or recessive allele is going to represent cystic fibrosis, that heredity disorder. So let's look at our example. So a man who's a carrier for cystic fibrosis, that's going to be this guy right here. Remember from our earlier slides, a carrier, okay, is heterozygous, all right? And he has a child with a normal woman. Now, technically normal could be big A, or big A, little a. But since the problem already told us that you're either a carrier or you're normal, we can assume that as normal, she is not a carrier. So she would be homozygous dominant. Now we can fill in for the children, and we want to know what's the probability that they're going to have a child with cystic fibrosis. Well, that's going to be a little a child, and we have no children who have that. So fortunately, all of their children will be healthy and not have this genetic disorder. Hopefully that was some good practice. Give some more monohybrid crosses a shot, and you'll get this skill down in no time.